So you're at Columbia, right, Dr. Hendricks?
I am, sir. Yes. Uh-huh.
Yeah, cool. How do you like living in New York? I've always wanted to. Love the
It's
city.
uh it's great most of the time, but it's I mean, man, it's more than a notion. It's something going on around you all the time. It's hard to relax for me.
I
And
bet. No,
yeah,
no, I'm sure. All right, we gotta get started bubble chat.
okay.
Okay, it is my great pleasure to introduce one of the first events for the Institute for Christian Socialism. We are really excited to be chatting today with Dr. Obery Hendricks. For those of you who don't know, Dr. Hendricks teaches at Columbia University in good old NYC, which we were just chatting about. And Dr. Hendricks has written a number of books, two of which I've read, which we'll be discussing. One is The Politics of Jesus, which is really an apocryphal kind of reinterpretation, both of the Gospels and of Christ's life and the context in which he engaged in his religious activism from a left viewpoint. And the more recent one is Christians Against Christianity, which covers how the evangelical right in the United States and indeed beyond is really engaging in a program that's very deeply counter to the authentic spirit of the Christian mission. So thank you so much for being with us today here, Dr. Hendricks. It's absolutely fantastic to have you. And I'm sure all of our members are really excited to hear you talk also.
No, thank you. It's my pleasure. I'm really glad to be in conversation with you.
Thanks. So I thought we would open kind of with a bit of a personal question, because there's really no other way of diving into some of this material. You open the Politics of Jesus with a really spiritual and intensely personal set of ruminations about your own journey, how it is that you came to believe in the radical message of the Gospels, and how you also came to believe that this radical message had been neutered over time. And can you tell us a little bit about what experiences brought you to this conviction? And can you tell us a little bit about the other people in your life that brought you to this view?
Mhm. Thank you. I appreciate that question. It's as I look back, it's almost like I was destined to go this way. One might say I was born in struggle. I was born in Farmville, Virginia, in Prince Edward County, Virginia, where they closed the schools rather than desegregate them. So one might say I was born in struggle. Family came north to Newark, New Jersey. And in my teens, I got involved in the Black Cultural Nationalist Movement, organization headed by Mary Baraka. And that experience was very formative for me, intellectually, but also it really caused me to focus on liberation, on struggle and in political injustice. That became part of my perspective on the world. I mean, how I looked at the world analytically and prescriptively too, I think. It's a long story. I mean, I ended up on Wall Street. Don't ask me how. I did, and I was there for 8
A little bit
long
of time
years.
with Mammon before Christ, eh?
Yeah, yeah. But I was there for 8 years, and I learned. I got a pretty good view of the workings of capitalism, and how little it cares about humanity and how deleterious it is to the human spirit. And so but I eventually ended up in seminary. That's another story. And I was there because I understood, I saw the church, the Black church, as my site of struggle and service. And I wasn't crazy about going to seminary. I wasn't crazy about thoughts of ministry, but I realized that's where the people are, and they're hurting, and they could not be just left to the wiles of the preachers. So I ended up going to seminary. And while I was in seminary, I was exposed to Richard Horsley, New Testament scholar, who's just very important in terms of understanding a liberative view of the radicality of the gospel. Howard Thurman's book, Jesus and the Disinherited, which really predates as far as I know, all of the radical New Testament scholarly understanding of Jesus in America, at least in the mainstream. And I was in seminary, Princeton Seminary, which is fairly liberal. And because I had this perspective from my youth, when I started really reading the gospel, I was able to see it through the eyes, not of a church boy, but of an aspiring freedom fighter. And that and Ched Meyer's book, what is it called? Something, The Strong Man. And from there, it just started all falling into place. Then when I got into graduate school at Princeton University, I was blessed to have as one of my dissertation advisors, Elaine Pagels, who wrote the Gnostic Gospels, and John Gager, who was a Pauline scholar, but he introduced the notion of cognitive dissonance into New Testament studies. And it was really fortuitous that I had these two, because both of them had gotten death threats when they made their initial contributions. And John Gager actually had been a freedom rider who had been incarcerated at Parchment Farm. I mean, hell on earth, because he supported the civil rights movement. So there was no way I could be too radical for them. I was able to explore as far as possible, and that's how I eventually developed the perspective where I understood the radicality of the gospel, and the manifest political dimension, not the only dimension, but a political dimension to the gospel.
Yeah, absolutely. And one of the kind of tragic features that comes through in your writing is the fact that were Jesus teleported here today, he would probably recognize the world that we inhabit, because it looks sadly a lot like the world that he inhabited, right? There's evil all over the place. There are exploitative systems. There's bigotry. There's idolatry. And this is one of the things that really comes through with extraordinary power in the politics of Jesus, where you point out that we sometimes, again, whitewash the colonial and imperial dimensions of what was going on in Galilee, and the way that there was also collaboration on the part of many people with this exploitative system. And you say that that's not something that we should do. We really need to foreground that socio-historical context to understand what it was that Christ was trying to do when he began his mission. So can you talk a little bit about that? Because it's definitely not something, for instance, I learned about in Sunday school.
Help me out again. Just recap it for me.
Well, in the politics of Jesus, you talk, for instance, about how at the time, the Roman Empire was essentially occupying most of the Middle East, what we now call the Middle East. It was extracting extraordinary amounts of wealth from the people, often for violent projects of further imperial expansion. And you point out that not only was the area a colonial state, but it was one where there were vast inequalities even within the colonized states. So you point out that Galilee was a very poor region, even within Judea, and that many of the most affluent people, for instance, in Jerusalem, the urbanites, benefited from the Roman occupation. And so what did? They do what a lot of people do, which is they supported it. And they found ways of justifying it by pointing to scripture, saying, you shouldn't be too critical, you shouldn't be too violent, you shouldn't be too uppity. If this is what God wants, this is what God wants. Who are you to kind of say otherwise? And you point out that Jesus responded very directly to that.
What was the question?
So just can you describe a little bit about the time period that Jesus was living in, and why this shaped his way of thinking about things, and why this shaped the kind of activism he engaged in?
It's largely forgotten that Jesus was an imperial subject. Like Howard Thurman said that if a Roman soldier kicked him into a ditch, he'd just be another Jew in a ditch. So he came up in a situation which he was twice oppressed, maybe thrice. He was marginalized, mistreated, looked down upon by the Jerusalemites. and those in Judea. And of course, he was an imperial subject. But just a few years before Jesus was born, there was a terrible massacre in Sepphoris, half day's walk from Nazareth. Sepphoris was an affluent city that they felt they were paying too many taxes, and they had the nerve to protest. And of course, Caesar's legions wouldn't stand for it, and they attacked, and they killed many, many people. Josephus tells us, he's almost certainly exaggerating, he says that 3,000 of the residents of Sepphoris were crucified between Nazareth and Sepphoris. And 3,000, it could have been 300, even if it was just 30, that would have been just the most traumatic experience for that little village of Nazareth. Because, and also the Caesar's legions would not let them take the dead bodies down from the cross. So what we had was of folks, some who lived for days on the cross, screaming and in agony, defecating, urinating on themselves. And then when they died, their bodies rotted, and the stench wafted into Nazareth. You can imagine the fear and trepidation and trauma these people experienced. And in the book, in Politics of Jesus, I use the example that Emmett Till was killed 60 years ago or so now, or more. And you know, the picture of his ravaged body still sends chills through 20 million African Americans. So you can imagine a handful of Nazarenes were traumatized, and they probably were still talking about this. And so Jesus, this would have been part of the habitus that Jesus grew up in. Also, you know, the Roman soldiers, they don't talk about this much, but Roman soldiers really had carte blanche to do what they wanted to do. If they felt they needed provisions, they could take whatever they wanted. They also at times kidnapped women. And Jane Shaberg, in her book, it's a fine book with an unfortunate title called The Illegitimacy of Jesus. She raises a question about, well, there was a question about Jesus' birth, obviously, you know. Jane says that when you think about it, Jesus' mother could have been the victim of rape. And she explains it, and briefly, we're told that Joseph was blameless unto the law. And if that really is the case, well, if the woman he was betrothed to was pregnant, that meant that he'd have to have her stoned, at the very least, denounced. You know, if a woman, but if a woman was raped in the country, because it's the logic is that no one could hear her scream, then she would not have to be stoned. So, I mean, that's a quick explanation. The point I'm suggesting, there's terrible horror in Jesus' setting. There was terrible poverty in Jesus' setting. There was terrible fear of the Romans. And then you had the taxation that sometimes could be as high as 25% of subsistence production, which meant they had to go in debt in order to pay taxes. You're talking about people who were just like in the Marvin Gaye song, "Makes Me Want to Holler," you know, the way they do my life. And that's forgotten sometimes. So that informed Jesus' consciousness. And he grew up with a consciousness of being a member of an oppressed people who needed liberation and who needed hope.
Yeah, absolutely. And that comes through super vividly in your book. And what also comes through vividly is how Jesus responded to this, sometimes in ways that aren't acknowledged, certainly by, you know, waspy evangelical churches, because he could get angry, he could get condemnatory, and he had no fear, let's put it that way, of saying that the situation is kind of bullshit and it needs to stop, and always doing so in the name of the poor, the dispossessed, prostitutes, thieves, any person who's seen to be downtrodden in society. And that's not the vision you often hear about when you go to Sunday school. again, I was raised Roman Catholic, and Jesus was a pretty stalwart, traditional, conservative guy, a lot like the people, I grew up around. And so I'm wondering, can you tell us a little bit about this radical Jesus, right? Why has he been neutered by so many different interpretations, and how can we recover his edge? Let's just put it that way.
Well, I think there's a lot to it. I mean, there were a lot of steps in which it happened. I think it was pretty well codified by Constantine. But prior to that, you got to remember that crucifixion, the whole purpose of crucifixion was to terrorize people. And so the followers of Jesus were traumatized and terrorized. And it was very dangerous to align yourself with a figure that you extolled as a seditionist, as a political radical. And so, the higher spiritual dimension of his ministry seems to be what was held up and extolled. And we see that with Paul. Paul had came to have a good deal of influence, and he didn't recognize really any radical political dimension. And then we start to see it. We start to see Jesus, his politicality elide more and more as we go through the New Testament writings. So you get to the Deutero-Pauline letters. They're giving a hierarchy that Jesus fought against, right? Patriarchy. They are justifying slavery, like First Peter and First Timothy. So by the time we get to the pastoral epistles, well, even when we get to the Deutero-Pauline epistles and Paul, we don't really see this radicality. The radicality of the Lord's Prayer doesn't come through at all. When Paul doesn't even, I think he uses kingdom of God once or twice, but it has nothing to do with the radicality of this notion of the sole sovereignty of God, meaning that no empire should be has a legitimate right to rule, which is sedition under Roman law, which will get you crucified. Then when we get to First Timothy, and it's like slavery's okay. It's okay to have a Christian enslaver, and it's all turned upside down. But then Constantine, I think, put the icing on the cake when, with him, the faith of the oppressed that Jesus began, the faith of the oppressed and the struggle for justice in this world, we see expressed in Luke 4:18. With Constantine, that faith of the oppressed becomes the official religion of the oppressor who tortured Jesus to death. And what also happens is that they codify orthodox doctrines, right? And so with Constantine, what became the mark of faith is not the primary mark is not how you live, but what you confess, whether you believe in the orthodoxy. And the fact that Constantine was an emperor, of course, he would not support or countenance any reading of Jesus that would upset his status quo, or imperial status quo, which he believed in, whether he was an emperor or not. And since that time, mainstream Christianity has been aligned with the ruling order ever since then. And so when mainstream Christianity is aligned with those who are in positions of power and oppression, of course they're not going to they're not going to interpret anything that Jesus said as being radical. And so I think that's how we get to this domesticated, neutered, apolitical Jesus that made it so easy to be weaponized by this evil onslaught of the right-wing evangelicals that we see today.
Yeah, absolutely. And like one of the things that I really enjoyed about both your books is that there's a real passionate anger, but a righteous anger that flows through them. Because there is something perverse about a religion that started off saying, "Blessed are the meek and blessed are the poor, because the kingdom of God is yours," and becoming the official state religion of a tyrannical empire, or warping into whatever the hell the prosperity gospel is today, right? And that's something that you take a lot of digs at in your new book, and I really appreciated it. I was cheering you on the whole way. But while reading them, I wrestled with some problems myself, and I was wondering if you could speak to this spiritually, right? Because on the one hand, that kind of righteous anger can be a call to justice, and I think that's extremely important. And the neutered Jesus that we are often presented with doesn't call us to justice the way that the real Jesus would when motivated by these feelings. On the other hand, anger can so often become perverse. It can lead to further violence. It can lead to further suffering. So I was wondering, when reading your book, how it is that as left Christians, we should understand our relationship to righteous anger, and what the proper way of living in those feelings is, without kind of trying to repress them or soften them, but also without leading us to be tempted by the allure of violence, hatred, resentment, all those kind of ugly satanic feelings.
No, that's a very good point. Well, one thing you notice, we see Jesus in his most human, I think, in the Gospel of Mark.
Right.
And what we see there, that Jesus is angry a number of times, but what all those instances of anger have in common is that he's always angry about the mistreatment of someone else. He doesn't evince anger at his own treatment. It's only about injustice of the community, and unjust treatment of the community. And so I think that is a good model. We're human, so we can't help feeling anger at times, but even when we're mistreated, but what Jesus modeled is that he maintained self-control. He maintained dignity. I think dignity is a very, very important word that's not used enough. He maintained a dignified self-control. And even when he got angry over injustice, he didn't lose it. So from where I stand, anger, the best anger is about unjust treatment of anyone in the community. But even if we feel some other kinds of anger, about being mistreated ourselves or even being insulted, the key is to maintain, dignity and self-control. And I think Jesus models that. So to summarize, anger, righteous anger, absolutely has a place when it's anger over injustice. Other than that, we have to be careful, I think, to make sure that we channel it in constructive and positive and not self-destructive ways.
No, absolutely. I mean, when I listened to Dr. King's speech talking about how not just blacks, but so many people, I'd say even in the United States, are owed a huge debt that's never been repaid and still hasn't been repaid. It's hard to think how else you can feel about that, but extremely angry, right? To think that, this is long overdue. The time is not in the future. The time is not for reform incrementally. The time is now, right? But on the other hand, just look around in the newspaper, what happened this week. We all know that anger can lead us to horrible places, right? And it's a very difficult thing, spiritually for me at least, to mince those feelings and to know when it is that I'm feeling anger in the right way and when it is that I'm being allured into hateful feelings that might be understandable, but they're not good. They're not good for me, right? And I don't think they're good for anyone, really.
Yeah. Well, in spiritual terms, and now I'm speaking from intellectual understanding as much as as personal experience. You know, spiritually, I think that we are being called to try to transcend some of these feelings. You know, Paul, when I read Borg and Croissant's book, the first Paul, which I recommend to everyone, a short book, very readable, but it's profound. I realized that, you know, Paul wasn't just a scold, always scolding folk for their foibles and misdeeds. But I kind of realized that he was, you remember, it's in Second Corinthians, where he talks about going up to the third heaven. And then he says in his letters, I want you to be like me. I understand Paul is one who is, as a mystic, who tries to help other folk to move past the kinds of behaviors that are holding them back from greater growth. So what that says to me, spiritually, is that we are to try to to transcend those lower feelings. I mean, I'm still too easily insulted, and that's something that I know disturbs my peace. So, even though we know that Jesus was deeply political, I mean, his spiritual teaching is, I mean, has to be factored in, because the reality of it is, he wasn't able to say in Luke 4:18, the Spirit of the Lord is upon me because he anointed me to preach good news to the poor and liberation to the oppressed. He couldn't do that until after he had been out in the desert for those 40 days, meditating and contemplating and fasting and doing spiritual disciplines and ministrations to raise him to the point where he could, where he was totally in control and totally focused on the welfare of the community and others, and not just on himself. So I think that's a great, model to keep in mind.
Absolutely. And I think one of the challenges we face as left-wing Christians in the world today is the fact that so much of the world around us doesn't seem to allow for that kind of spiritual growth, or at least it sometimes even actively prohibits it or disincentivizes it. And this kind of leads us into the next bit of the conversation I want us to chat about, which is your new book, Christians Against Christianity. Because one of the kind of remarkable things, the journeys that you trace for us, is how it is that a religion that, again, once said, blessed are the meek, blessed are the poor, the kingdom of heaven is you, it transitioned into this kind of hideous mockery of the faith, where you have somebody like Donald Trump being applauded by evangelical leaders as Christ's instrument here on earth, at the same time as he's locking up thousands of children whose families were just trying to come to the United States or Canada for a better life, at the same time as there's brutal crackdowns on people of color all through the United States, catalyzed by, the murder of a man of color on camera in front of everybody. Awful stuff, and apologized for or even defended by so many evangelicals. So can you, and not just evangelicals, but a lot of the religious right, can you tell us a little bit about how this emerged in the United States and why it is that the religious right has become so influential, not just in conservative circles, but everywhere?
Yeah. Well, in the history of evangelicals in America, as you know, there was a very constructive, positive strand, evangelicalism. I mean, most of the abolitionists were evangelicals. Evangelicals were concerned about workers' rights, and there was one I mentioned in my book, one gentleman who even in the 1880s was talking about the need for an 8-hour workday. And so, I mean, they were very progressive. They were very active in the institutional church movement in the beginning of the 20th century to serve immigrant populations and all that, right? But that change didn't just change, it was purposely changed in response to the New Deal. FDR came into office, he changed the philosophy of government so that it didn't just serve the oligarchs and their needs and interests, but he recognized that government had a responsibility to the common good. You know, the Bible actually says that. It says that, kings and princes and those in positions of governance and wealth have a responsibility to do justice and to take care of the poor and the weak. The Bible says that, numerous times. Roosevelt was consistent, I mean, in general terms, with the biblical witness, but the captains of industry, the heirs of the robber barons, the big time capitals like the DuPont brothers and the Harvey Firestones and all of them, they didn't want the philosophy of government to change anymore because, of course, it limited their purposes and their control and their ability to make untrammeled profits.
So and if I could just say, you still see that today. Peter Thiel, the founder of PayPal, wrote an essay in 2012 where it's like, United States was a free country, which is a baffling thing to say if you're anybody but a wealthy white guy, right? We were a free country up until the 1920s, and that's where it all started to go wrong. And what I started to realize is that I'm not sure that freedom, by which he means capitalism and democracy, are compatible with one another. Because the minute, democracy really started to kick in, starting in the 1920s with FDR, everything's gone downhill, right?
Yeah,
so little exactly. Has changed.
And so out of that mentality, they hired this guy, what's this, Fiefeld, Reverend Fiefeld in Los Angeles. They hired this evangelical to plead the case for return to laissez-faire economics, laissez-faire governmental policy, domestic policy, and to give it a veneer of religiosity, right? And so they started hiring these evangelical preachers who started this whole thing about capitalism and Christianity are compatible, and they started the terrible propaganda against socialism, right?
Yeah.
And the same argument that we hear today, they started in the late 20s, the early 30s. So since that time, we've had that stratum, but we really didn't get the ugly folks that we have now, what we might call the modern right-wing evangelical movement, until around 80. It started with Jerry Falwell and Pat Robertson, those guys who wanted to defend Bob Jones University right to be racially segregated and dispute racist propaganda. I mean, and Carter's IRS said any school that practiced segregation, could not be tax exempt and was not eligible for federal funds. So these guys, they went apoplectic. It's like, no, we want to support their right to be racist. And that's how this movement started. It didn't start with Roe v. Wade. That came later. And so we've seen it come forward. They had a meeting where they decided, the top evangelicals had a meeting in early 80s where they tried to decide what wedge issues they would use now that the Red Scare was dying out. What could they use to scare the people and get them all worked up to help them dominate American society? They came together and they decided that they would use the issue of homosexuality and the issue of abortion. And so we see, and that's what they did. Randall Balmer, of course, documents this in his book, Thy Kingdom Come. And so we see this trajectory, and through the civil rights movement, and they sort of lost ground in the civil rights movement until this sick demon, this sick piece of trash, Donald Trump, stands up and opens up the Pandora's box, almost like a metaphysical source of evil. It's amazing. He opens up the Pandora's box of hate and racism and xenophobia and homophobia, and that's how we are where we are today on that trajectory. So it was tamped down. It was there, but it wasn't cool to be outwardly racist anymore until Trump started attacking Obama and saying outrageous things, and that empowered these people to be who they are today. And it's horrible. It's anti-Christian. It's anti-biblical. It's almost like metaphysical evil, because it keeps coming, and it's getting stronger and stronger and more dangerous. It's very frightening.
It is. I mean, I'll never really forget when he came down that big stupid elevator and fucking, what did he open his whole campaign with? It was Mexico not sending their best people. They're sending drugs. They're sending criminals. They're rapists. And some, I suppose, are good people. And there was all this horrible anti-immigrant stuff framed in the most racist and xenophobic possible terms. And one of the things that constantly occurred to me when all these evangelicals were backing him up were, isn't this the faith where when you knocked on the door and you said, I need help, the Christian thing to do was to say, come in, you're my neighbor, right? And what are we doing right now? There are people coming in from many parts of Central America, including many parts of Central America, but that have been devastated by U.S. foreign policy. Exactly. And they're fleeing because of that. What are we saying? There's no room at the end, get out somewhere else, right? Yeah. So just really, truly sick and demonic stuff. But,
and I tried to document all of that, and let's add that throughout the Bible, the Hebrew Bible especially, we're told how to treat immigrants, how to accept them, and even how to support them until they can get on their own feet, and they don't have to assimilate; they just have to respect our laws and culture and customs. In fact, one of the reasons tithing was instituted was to protect, support immigrants until they could support themselves. So for them to take that anti-immigrant stance is totally anathema to the biblical witness.
Absolutely. I mean, one of the things you point out also is that Jesus himself was a refugee, right? When Herod was trying to persecute his family, he fled to another part of the Roman Empire, Egypt, and he sought sanctuary there until he was old enough to come back, right? Do you really think that this is a guy who would sit there and say, when you have little children, some as young as, 2 or 3 babies, when they're coming to the border saying, we need help, you throw them in cages and then send them back so that their parents can be shot? Mind-boggling, right? Mm-hmm. But I mean, your book is a very brave text, and I really liked it a lot, because one of the things that you point out, and again, is that you shouldn't be afraid to use moral language and call a spade, and when something's wrong, just to say, this is wrong. You shouldn't be kind of wiffly-waffly about it. And it's also a brave book because you're not afraid to start some dialogues for left-wing Christians that a lot of us have been uncomfortable about having for a long time. One of the ones that I did want to talk about a bit, because it's been in the news lately, is the issue of abortion. So you point out in the book that obviously people of good faith are going to have very different opinions about abortion, and that we can have those dialogues, and no one's voice should necessarily predominate, but we shouldn't take the evangelical position, the right-wing evangelical position, for granted, that abortion is just this unbelievable evil, and it's the primary thing that we need to confront in our day. And you give a lot of different reasons for that. One of them is that you point out that actually the right-wing evangelical movement didn't actually get its start through anti-abortion activities, but in these kind of racial animosities and racial anxieties. But another thing you point out is, of course, that this has been a very convenient trope for them to lean on whenever it is that they've wanted to pass other kinds of reactionary policies, and they can get their base riled up by just saying abortion, abortion, abortion. And another argument that you make that I personally found very interesting is you point out that there isn't necessarily a lot of scriptural or scholastic arguments that you can make to support the claim that life just begins at conception, the way that some evangelicals claim. So you point out, that St. Thomas Aquinas and Augustine both had very complicated views on the matter, but they both stated that it seems pretty clear to them, at least, that life doesn't begin, life begins at conception, but that the soul doesn't enter the body at conception. So can you talk a little bit about these controversies, and how is it that you think we should think, and this is just your personal opinion, about abortion from a Christian perspective, and how do you think we can have discussions on the left from a Christian perspective about abortion without people frankly just want to tear each other's heads off?
Yeah. Well, I mean, it's important to know that the Bible says nothing about abortion, about voluntary abortion. Exodus 21, verse 22, 23, in fact, make a distinction between a living, breathing mother and a fetus. It says that if two men are fighting and they injure a mother and injure or kill a fetus, that they must be punished. And the punishment is eye for an eye for the mother, but for the unborn fetus, it's a financial fine. So it makes a distinction on the value. And it says a fetus does not have the same value as a living breathing out of the womb person. And so that's important. And the only place the Bible says anything about abortion is Numbers 5, that says that that if a married woman gets pregnant by someone other than her husband, God will punish her by aborting her child. Other than that, it says nothing about abortion. So it's not a biblical, a Christian issue. And the stuff about different places, it says, well, God knew me in the womb and this, that, and the other. And John the Baptist leaped in his mother's womb. Those say nothing about when life begins. In fact, those are, by their very nature, sort of unique circumstances. And so for us, I mean, I think very few people in their right mind, maybe no in their right mind, will say that abortion is a good thing. We recognize that sometimes it's a necessary thing. We also have to recognize, though, that no one has a right to lord it over anyone else's body. And so if it's not a biblical sin, if it's not biblically murder, if a zygote is not yet a person, we can have our various opinions on abortion, but we don't have the right to oppress other people with those with our opinions. But more importantly, if we're pro-life, then if we say it's life in the womb, then why isn't it life outside of the womb? Why don't we care enough about the child when the child is born as we care when it's a fetus? It's almost like, they had the shooting at the school, 19 kids. Oh, no fetuses were killed. Oh, okay, let's move on. I mean, it's that kind of thing. So, but more than that, if we care about life and we say we care about a mother and we don't want abortions, because women are going to find a way to get an abortion if they really want one, then why don't we set up society in a way that gives the kind of support to this living, breathing child and mother who needs it, so they can have a decent life? How can we tell a mother that, look, you're going to have to struggle and be impoverished, for the next 18 years because you don't have much of an education, blah, blah, blah. We don't have the right to do that. But if it was really about human life from a Christian perspective, then we have to try to build the kind of safety net for expectant mothers who really need the help so they could raise a child in a healthy way to be a healthy member of society. I think that's our real challenge there, is to try to to build a society that takes care of children, really values children. We don't have that in this society.
No, absolutely not. I mean, I was watching a documentary about some inner city schools in Detroit, right, where students were going, there was no running water, there was mold growing out of the wall. Obviously, there's a racial dimension to this because there always is, right? Mm-hmm. And you just sit there thinking to yourself, like, how can you call yourself a society that claims to care about children when you're sending kids to a school like that where they could get sick and die from drinking the water? It's unbelievable, right? And it's in the richest country in the world, where there are people who have so much money that they're sending rocket ships into space because they have nothing better to spend it on.
Yeah.
You can't think that maybe it'd be best to get them to build a school in Detroit to fix up some of the stuff that's going on in Seattle, where people have to bus an hour and a half just so that their kids have a chance at a decent existence. Come on, it's bizarre.
They care more about the unborn. These right-wing evangelicals, they raise more hell about the unborn than they do the already born. I mean, that's obvious. You don't hear them. You don't hear them hot and bothered about. These children they're hungry and they're this and that. They don't even talk about that. It's like we care about the fetus, which it's so sick and backward. It's anti-gospel. It's anti-Christian in that they're not caring for the least of these, like Jesus said.
No, absolutely. I mean, you have a Republican Party that claims that we need to become a Christian nation, and just a couple of weeks ago voted against $25 million for baby formula. I mean, baby formula for all things, right? It's like,
unbelievable.
Can't believe it. Yeah. But I mean, I just had two final questions because I know there are a lot of people who want to talk to you and I don't want to hold up. But my first one is going to be a bit of a bleak question because there's no doubt that we're in a pretty dark moment right now, right? I mean, in any kind of instance where somebody feels that they have the right to walk into a school and murder, what is it, 19? Keeps on going up every day, 19, 21
kids and
children.
Adults,
Yeah, and I was just watching an interview with a dad. He's a nurse, and he found out while he was helping some of the kids coming from the hospital that his own daughter had been shot. And he held up a picture of her. I was just like 7 years old, right? I don't understand how anybody could aim a gun at this little girl and decide that she needed to die. It's unbelievable, right? And I want to know, how do we wind up in a society where there aren't just the occasional person who will decide to do something like that, because there's always been those types, right? But this is now a weekly thing, right? Where people get shot because of their race, they get shot when they're children, they get shot, if they're just going to a Walmart, right? How have we wound up in that dark place?
I don't know. It seems like there's always been an undercurrent of hatred of the other in this country, depending on who the other was seen at a particular time. African Americans have always been seen as the other from the beginning, though we're not the only ones. Asians and Jews have been, but I think that the fact that this country was founded on injustice, codified slavery in the Constitution, though we're supposed to have a sundown date, but we know better than that. I think that's it. I also think that this perversion that America has perverted Christianity, from the beginning. We've heard very little talk about love, very little talk about justice. We don't hear that at all from the right wing these days. I think that's, and then there's the breakdown of community as a result of capitalism. I think the confluence of individualism wrought by the capitalism, and then we have this libertarian individualism that has permeated Christianity. I think we have all this alienation. Folk don't think in terms of folk do not seem to see themselves as part of a community anymore with responsibility to others, and then again, hateful racial xenophobia has always been beneath the surface, and all we've ever needed is for some demagogue to appeal to it. I don't see any hope for the country, honestly. I'd love to, but it scares me to death. I have a great granddaughter who's 4. I'm like, what kind of country will she have? But how are we going to get over this hate? How are we going to? I mean, I thought that this hateful, particularly this virulent strain of racism, was that it was dying down, but It was just lying dormant. And so I don't expect it ever to go. And then you look at Hitlerism and the cult of the hate cult of Hitler. I expect that we'll have a hate cult of Trump, for years to come. And so what can we do? We have to hold fast to the gospel and hold fast to, and we have to promulgate love your neighbor as yourself, what that means in economic and political and social terms. And then talk about Matthew 25:31-46, loving our neighbor, caring for the least of these, and hold these up as core gospel commandments, and hope that we can get those who are wrong but sincerely wrong, meaning that they're sincere, they just are wrong. Maybe we can get them to move toward the middle. Other than that, I don't see how we're gonna. And as far as democracy, no, we've seen the high point of the little democracy we've had. I can't imagine how we can come back from this, because a large part of the country just doesn't want democracy anymore.
Yeah, and I think you saw that on January 6th very overtly, right? Where even to this day, after just onslaughts of analysis, pointing out that this election was won fair and square by Joe Biden, there are still millions of people across the country that think their right to dictate to the rest of us, who's supposed to govern us, was stolen from them. And that's the way it is. But I just want to say, do you really think things are that bleak? There have to be some signs that give you a little bit of optimism. Maybe use Tolkien's phrase, hope without guarantees, right? I mean, look, I'm involved in DSA. I'm really happy. I never would have thought, when I was 20, that an organization like that would exist, let alone have 100,000 members. I want to believe that somebody like Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez or Bernie Sanders would be national figures with millions of supporters. Is there anything out there that gives you a little bit of hope or makes you think something might happen?
Yeah, I'm glad you raised it, because I did paint the bleakest possible picture. No, I think we're seeing a great rising in consciousness in these oncoming generations. Folk are starting to understand socialism better, and the stats that most young people are either they support socialism or they're open to it. And we're seeing stronger racial coalitions, fighting side by side in justice. What worries me, though, is that the hateful side seems to have so much more momentum and enthusiasm. It's like their hatred compels and impels them more strongly than our resistance to it. Because hate is a stronger emotion, I guess. I don't know. But I think that, it's going to be a hell of a fight. They're not going to just run over us. We're going to, so I don't know. And I don't, as far as and let me just say this. Right-wing evangelicals make up 50% of the electorate. But they control what's going on in this country. Until we can do something, and because they control what's going on in this country, and they control so much of the discourse, they are winning, and they are standing in the way of a more just and loving society. Until we can loosen their grip, I can't imagine how it can get better, because they control the oil, they control the most powerful communications media. They have the think tanks. They have all of that, and until we can loosen their grip, they're going to continue lying to people, fooling people, telling them what they want to hear, to our detriment.
Oh, absolutely. I'm a good enough socialist to believe that the old mantra is probably right. Sometimes you adopt pessimism of the intellect and optimism of the will. And it's what I tell myself whenever we come into moments like this, probably because, in addition to spiritual wisdom, it's just something I need to tell myself. Right. But
right. And plus, we just need to struggle. I mean, don't get me wrong.
Yeah.
I believe in struggling. We got to struggle, and no matter what, I'm not giving up. I don't see, I don't see a way. But it's like just like you boxing. All you need to do is get in a punch. You never know. What's going to happen if you keep staying in the ring.
Yeah, I know. I mean, when they unionized that first Amazon warehouse, one of my favorite quotes ever was like, "We'd like to thank Jeff Bezos for going up into space because while he was up there, we were down here organizing." Right? I never would have thought I'd see that, but here we go. Right? So, I do think that there are a few rays of light in the darkness, or at least maybe I just searched them out, and that's what I see.
No, they're there. I agree with you. I think you mentioned. I think we mentioned a few. Mm-hmm.
Fantastic. Well, listen, Dr. Hendricks, it was a real pleasure talking to you. I don't want to take up any more of the audience's time since I see that we have a few questions coming in now. But I'd just like to say to everyone once more, Dr. Hendricks' new book is Christians Against Christianity, released in 2021, I believe.
Yeah.
Yeah. So you can pick it up. It's very, very close to hot off the press. And it's one of the best spiritual diagnoses of our time that I've read in a long time. And it's also just a great scintillating read. I think I killed it in about a day or two. Can't quite remember because just some of the history that you relay is really, really unforgettable. So thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you, brother. Mm-hmm.
Okay. So I think we have questions coming in. Aaron, do you want me to relay them to you? Do you want me to relay them to Obery, or do you want people to be able to ask them directly?
Yeah, why don't you go and relay them to them now?
Okay, so first question in the Q&A is, assuming electoral politics as part of the toolkit to enact change, do you think Christian socialists in the United States should be focusing on strengthening their political power in the Democratic Party or some existing party, or is it time to try and build power in another party or some combination of the two? So very much a strategic question.
Yeah, that's for me. That's a hard one because on the one hand, we know how terribly corrupt and dishonest and backward these people are, but
I still remember that Simpsons episode. It's my favorite little political gif in it. I don't know if you ever watched the show, right? But it's an elephant. It's walking through the room, and it's the Republican Party, and it just says, we're pure evil. We'll take everything that you have, and then it walks to the Democratic Party, and it's like, how could you trust us to govern? And it's like, we don't know what we're doing.
Yeah. So I mean, how to, and so I think we like we have Ocasio-Cortez fighting the fight. We have the senator from Vermont. We have Bernie Sanders fighting the fight. I think we have to work from the inside and the outside. We have to struggle on the outside to raise consciousness, but work prescriptively to advocate and prescribe the kinds of policies that are consistent with our belief. One belief that I have, strategic belief, is that we don't always have to name things socialist or democratic socialist strategically, because there are a lot of folk who still are under that Red Scare kind of thing, and I think it's important to be strategic like that. But so we need to do it from the inside and the outside. But I don't see how we can get anywhere without trying to work on the inside as well, and that means a Democratic Party, unfortunately. But what choice do we have?
No, I think Noam Chomsky said something that was really smart about this when people are asking him, are you going to vote for Joe Biden in the 2020 election? And he said, yeah. And people were like, well, how can you do that? And he said, look, the reality is that politics doesn't begin and end with an election. In fact, if that's your approach to politics, then they've already won, right? You cast your ballot for somebody like Joe Biden to try to mitigate the damage, because the alternative is just unthinkable. Yes. And then the day after you win that election, small victory, you go out there and you start engaging in real politics, right? Organizing civil society groups, talking to people in your church, talking to people, in bowling alleys where they still exist, right? Whoever it is that you can talk to, and you organize and you try to make the world better. And
right. I mean, we have that that model, of course, in the gospel. Jesus, especially in the gospel of Mark, he was always on the way, raising people's consciousness, going around raising people's, because he knows you can't have a radical movement or revolution without raising folks' consciousness. I think we have to do a lot more of that. Bernie has done some of that. I don't know that we've done the best job so far of pleading our case, but I think that's something that we have to struggle. We have to struggle to do. Mm-hmm.
Well, just as a follow-up to that question, because a lot of people are asking this, do you think that what role do you think groups like DSA, Democratic Socialists of America, or ICS, the Institute for Christian Socialism, what role can they play within the Democratic Party? Should they just be critics? Should they be cheerleaders? What's their purpose?
Well, I know a number of political players, and I try to be in dialogue and to share some of our ideas, but I never talk about them as socialist ideas. I'm saying that to say that I think that we really can work to inform policy prescription and formulation, and we don't have to do it announce that we're doing it from a socialist perspective. I'm not ashamed of it, but strategically, it's easier to just present an idea without giving something that someone might find an obstacle. It's just not necessary to do that because the idea is the important thing. So yeah, I think that's what we should. And I think on the other hand, Democratic Socialists and ICS, well, we should be out. As I said earlier, we should be out promulgating and explaining what socialism is and why it's more humane, why it's more consistent with the biblical text, with the gospel, and why it'll be better for everyone. So one is sort of a stealth way of working in the system. Another way is getting out here and raising people's consciousness. I truly believe the more we tell our story. And I'm particularly talking from an ICS perspective, the more support we'll get, because we can argue the consistency of democratic socialism, the ethos, as well as some of the particulars, the congruence with the gospel. I learned a long time ago, if you can talk chapter and verse, you can at least get somebody's attention if they're a believer. You at least get a chance to talk to them, that even if they disagree or get angry, at least you got a ground to start with.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think, like you said earlier, a lot of those conversations are going to be difficult, but you shouldn't be afraid of them, right? Because if you're armed with the right spiritual weapons, and if you know the way to talk to people like that, then I think sometimes you can be surprised how people are maybe not willing to go all the way, but at least budge a little bit. And those are liberal victories that can compound over a long enough period of time.
Long as we're strategic, we don't have to go in there shouting, hey, we want a democratic socialist political economy. We don't need to do that. We do need to shout those policies, but we don't need to necessarily shout our organizations or affiliation or anything like that.
Absolutely. So unless there are any other questions, doesn't look like it. I just wanted to say one final time, thank you so much, Dr. Hendricks, for joining us tonight. It was a real pleasure talking with you. I had a million more questions, but then we'd be here for a million years and we wouldn't get anything done. So again, just one final time, pick up his new book, Christians Against Christianity, and hopefully you and I will get a chance to chat again, because it was a real pleasure.
Thank you for your time. I appreciate it. I enjoyed it.
Thank you so much, Dr. Hendricks. And wait, last question, I suppose, what cigar are you smoking anyway?
What's cigar? I smoke Javas. It's Drew Estate Java. It's very smooth and light. The only thing my wife will allow me to have in the house, and she's even trying to get me to stop that, but it's nice and light. You won't kill yourself with it.
Sure. Yeah, no, I still smoke cigarettes every now and then, and my wife gives me shit for it all the time. Understandably so. She loves me, right? But
that's right.
Okay, have a good night, Doug.